Hello everyone, here we'll try to learn about small intestinal motility. The learning objectives will be understand the functional modification in muscle layers in the intestinal wall to suit the intestinal motility, appreciate special electrophysiological properties of intestinal smooth muscle, name the types of intestinal motilities and the main functions of each of them, elucidate the mechanism of intestinal movements and their role in mixing, propelling, and absorption of food materials in GI tract, name the intestinal reflexes and give their functions, comprehend the physiological basis of motility disorders. The length of the small intestine is about 3/4 of the length of the whole GI tract. It measures about 600 centimeters. It takes 3 to 5 hours for the chyme to traverse in the small intestine. Small intestine consists of duodenum, jejunum, ileum. Duodenum is the first part of the intestine and constitutes around 5% of it. Jejunum constitutes 40% and the ileum constitutes more than 55% of the small intestine. The wall of the small intestine has all the layers of the gut. However, muscularis externa, consisting of outer longitudinal and inner circular muscles, is well developed in small intestine. Though the lymphatic nodules are less in jejunum, they are more in number in ileum and they extend to the submucosa. The lymphatic nodules provide immunity to the intestine. These are the different layers which are showing the uh, different layers of the intestine. You can see the openings of the crypts, then lamina propria, muscularis mucosa, submucosa, serosal layer, and longitudinal muscle layer. So again, these are the histological parts. Villi, lamina propria with a lymphatic nodule, uh, disrupted muscularis mucosa, lymphatic, then the submucosa, the inner and outer longitudinal layers of muscularis externa. Electrophysiology of intestinal smooth muscles. The frequency is highest in duodenum, about 15 per minute, and decreases slowly towards the ileum, where it is about 8 to 10 per minute. Slow waves are not always accompanied by a burst of actions of potential spikes. When slow wave is associated with spike, the contraction is stronger, and in its absence, that is when there is no spike, contraction is weaker or absent. A characteristic feature of slow waves of intestine is that they are localized to a short segment of intestine. Therefore, contraction is also localized to the segments. This results in segmentation type of movement in the intestine. The basal electrical rhythm is purely intrinsic. The frequency of action potential spike, which determines the strength of muscle contraction, depends on excitability of the smooth muscles. Parasympathetic stimulation enhances and sympathetic stimulation inhibits the intestinal motility. Types of intestinal movements. The intestinal movements carry out three primary functions: mixing the chyme with the digestive secretion, bringing the chyme in contact with the absorptive surface to the microvilli to increase the absorption, propelling the chyme towards colon. These functions are achieved by various small intestinal motilities. The motilities are segmentation, peristalsis, migrating myoelectric complex, contraction of the muscularis mucosa, villus contraction, and movements due to the intestinal reflexes. Segmentation. It is characterized by closely spaced contraction of the circular muscle layer. The rate of segmental contraction is same as that of frequency of slow waves. It is about 18 per minute in duodenum, 15 per minute in jejunum, 12 per minute in ileum. Segmentation contraction effectively mix chyme with pancreatic and intestinal secretions. Two nearby propulsive segments force the chyme towards each other to the receiving segment, which efficiently helps in mixing. They also bring the fresh chyme into the contact with the mucosal surface. Therefore, segmentation movements, also called as mixing type movements, they help in digestion and absorption of nutrients. So this is the diagram showing the segmental contraction and the propulsive segment and receiving segment. Peristalsis is a progressive contraction of the successive portion of circular smooth muscle of the small intestine. The wave of contraction moves in an orthograde direction. In fact, peristaltic wave spreads in both directions. However, wave towards the oral cavity, oral spread dies out after short distance, and wave towards colon, that is aboral spread, continues progressively. So this is called law of intestine. Peristaltic waves involves a smaller length of intestine. When chyme enters the intestine, the bolus of the chyme stretches its wall. The part of the intestine behind the chyme contracts and the part of the intestine in front of the chyme relaxes, and the ring of contraction proceeds in forward direction. The primary function of peristaltic movement is to propel the chyme in forward direction. So this is a diagram showing peristalsis in the small intestine. Note a ring of peristaltic contraction moves from the initial position to a new forward position, and thus peristalsis moves aborally. Sometimes the frequency of peristalsis increases to an extent that intestinal contents are emptied very fast with a speed of 20 centimeters per second into colon. So this is called as rush peristalsis. So this is typically seen with acute diarrhea. There are also antiperistaltic contraction in intestine. Antiperistalsis results in vomiting. Short range peristalsis also occurs in small intestine but less frequently. It occurs for a shorter part of intestine. Short range peristalsis along with segmentation uh, contraction decreases net rate of propulsion of chyme in forward direction. This allows the chyme to stay more time in intestine to facilitate digestion and absorption. Clinical significance. Administration of codeine decreases the motility of the intestine, therefore decreases the frequency of defecation. The decreased motility also prolongs the transit time for intestinal contents so that the more water and nutrients are reabsorbed. Laxatives increase intestinal motility and therefore shorten the transit time of the intestinal content. This increases the delivery of chyme and water into colon that causes diarrhea. Other motility, migrating myoelectric motor complex or MMCs. There is a burst of intestinal electrical and contractile activity once in about every 90 minutes. MMC starts in the stomach and is propagated throughout the intestine to the terminal part of the ileum. Once MMC reaches the distal end of ileum, a next MMC begins in the stomach. Likewise, MMC is repeated every 75 to 90 minutes. MMC results in vigorous and strong propulsive contraction. Therefore, this sweeps the intestine and empties the remaining contents into the colon. NMC cleans up the entire lumen of the stomach and intestine to keep the house ready for the next meal. So this is why MMC is called as housekeeper of small intestine. MMC also inhibits the migration of the colonic bacteria from colon into the intestine. Contraction of muscularis mucosa. Muscularis mucosa of small intestine contracts irregularly. These contractions alter the patterns of mucosal folds. Contraction occurs at a frequency of about 3 per minute. Such contraction help in mixing the luminal contents and also bringing the fresh chyme in contact with mucosal surface. Villus contraction. The villi of small intestine also contract irregularly, so this is called as villus contraction. This is typically seen in upper part of the small intestine. These contractions are especially meant for emptying the central lacteals of the villi. So there is also they also increase the intestinal lymph flow. Intestinal reflex. When part of intestine is over distended, the rest of the intestine relaxes. This is called intestinal reflex. It is mediated by local enteric neurons and vasovagal pathways. Gastrocolic reflex. When food enters the stomach, stretching of the stomach, the motility of the terminal part of the ileum is enhanced and ileocolic sphincter relaxes. This increases the entry of contents of the ileum into the colon through the ileocecal sphincter. This reflex is proposed to be mediated by vagus nerve. The law of intestine. When the bolus of chyme enters the intestine, the part of intestine behind the bolus contracts and the portion of the intestine ahead of it relaxes. This helps in propagation of ring of contraction in aboral direction. This response is known as law of intestine. This is meant to propel the intestinal contents in the forward aboral direction as occurs in peristalsis. Functions of ileocecal sphincter. This is also known as ileocecal wall. It separates the terminal part of the ileum from the cecum. Normally, the ileocecal sphincter is tonically contracted and therefore the sphincter remains closed most of the time and prevents small intestinal emptying. When peristaltic wave reaches the terminal part of the ileum, the sphincter relaxes so that ileal content enters the cecum. Distension of the ileum also causes opening of the ileocecal sphincter. On the other hand, distension of cecum causes closure of ileocecal sphincter. Ileocecal sphincter is also controlled by extrinsic nerve fibers. Coming to the applied uh, aspects, aerodynamic Alias, when the intestine is injured, excessively handled or mishandled, the smooth muscles of the intestine are inhibited. And this decreases the intestinal motility, sometimes even resulting in paralysis of the gut. So this is called as aerodynamic ileus or paralytic ileus. So this occurs following abdominal surgery. Peristalsis first starts in the small intestine, that is 6 to 8 hours later, followed by in the stomach 8 to 12 hours, and finally in the colon 2 to 3 days. Aerodynamic ileus is also observed in peritonitis. This occurs due to the increased discharge of non-adrenergic fibers in the splanchnic nerves. Intestinal colic. Severe abdominal cramps are experienced in localized obstruction of the small intestine. The segment proximal to the obstruction dilates and gets filled with the fluid and gas. This increases the pressure inside the lumen that causes compression of the blood vessels in the intestinal wall. Resulting local ischemia of the intestinal wall produces severe cramping pain. Abdominal cramps are also experienced in other diseases that results in distension of intestine. So this is in brief about the small intestine, its movements and some of the applied aspects related to small intestine. Thank you.